You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm welcoming a very special guest, Paris Underground Radio founder and producer Jennifer Geraghty. She's here to explore a fantastic French false friend whose definition is far broader than humor and jokes. Comédie. All right, welcome to our very special guest, Jennifer Geraghty. Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on Navigating the French.
Thank you, Emily. It's a real delight.
And, everybody who's been listening to this podcast for, how many years have we been, how many centuries have we been doing this? No, for however many episodes we've been doing this for. You are our producer. You are the founder of Paris Underground Radio, but you wear many hats. Can you tell folks a little bit about what you do here in France and what brought you here?
Yes, sure. Yeah. I think that to say I'm a multi-hyphenate is the most concise way to sum up who I am. I'm originally from New York. I've been living in Paris for about 12 years now. I started off as an actress and I went to school for that, and I performed in theater and television and film in both New York and Los Angeles. I eventually migrated behind the camera and became a screenwriter and producer and director, mostly of film and television. I also work as a voice acting coach. So I work with French actors who want to work in American English. And then about a year and a half ago, I had an idea to make a Paris-based podcast network called Paris Underground Radio with this beautiful podcast and you as a fabulous host.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate the accolades. And I also, I'm excited to get back to your roots because today the word that we are going to be discussing here on Navigating the French is comédie. So linked not to stand-up comedy, but to your first love of acting. So comédie, here on Navigating the French, we've talked a lot about false friends, false cognates. So words that look like they might mean the exact same thing in French and English, but actually don't. And comédie is one of these false friends. So could you first off just break down some of the differences between comedy and comédie?
Yes, I also love false friends. I find them very, very fun. So the difference between comedy and comédie is actually quite simple. In English, you just have to kind of like wrap your mind around it a little bit. So in English, comedy is something that makes you laugh, like comedy, ha, 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 this is funny, it's a comedy. In French, you have to kind of go back to the origin of theater, which the nerd in me love. Mm-hmm. So you have to go back to ancient Greece. And when the ancient Greeks were creating their first plays, they divided them into two categories, comedies and tragedies. And so the basic difference is that a comedy has a happy ending and a tragedy has an unhappy ending. People die, usually. So in French, we kind of keep that definition of what a comedy is. So you can have different kinds of comedy. You can have like comédie dramatique, which is like a dramatic comedy, or comédie humaine, which is human comedy, comédie musicale, or even comédie larmoyante, which is like a tearful comedy. So here, this is an extreme example, but if you take a movie like Life is Beautiful or Schindler's List, in English, we would not call those comedies.
No.
But in French, they are. They're comédie dramatique, so they're dramatic comedies because they end happily. And in English, we would never call them a dramatic comedy or a dramedy because you don't laugh.
Ah, right. Okay, so laughter is a big piece of this. So when you, I guess that's where you generalize that out then to have a comedian, a comédien, is not someone whose job it is to make you laugh. It's someone who's in a comedy.
That's exactly right. And apparently there's also, I went through this rabbit hole, apparently there's also a distinction between comédien and acteur. So a comedian in English would be like a stand-up comic. In French, a comédien is an actor. An acteur is also an actor. However, the distinction that I learned was that a comedian is someone who plays a role, and an acteur is someone who lives the role.
Oh man.
Yeah.
That feels like the difference between method acting and whatever the other one is. I'm sorry to my sister Juliet who does the other one. I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's just hubris.
Okay.
But I will also say that I think the definition of comédie is also changing in French, and recently it has evolved to include things that do make you laugh, even if they don't end happily.
Okay. So like what, for example?
Well, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Put you on the spot there.
But I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but if there were a play where a bunch of tragedies befell somebody and it was very funny, you know, this genre,
Yeah.
that could be considered a comedy if it makes you laugh.
Okay. Okay. So Romeo and Juliet, they have all those jokes at the beginning about Rosalind, and then they all die.
No, I think that's still a tragedy.
Still a tragedy. Got it. Okay. Well, I think, the career of actor, I feel in France, most often when people say that they work as an actor, they don't say je suis un acteur, je suis une actrice. They say je suis un comédien, je suis une comédienne. Is that true to your experience?
Yes, from what I read, with my own personal bias, I think if you were to call yourself an acteur, you'd be pretty pretentious.
Okay. And in terms of, growing up in the US, I think a lot of kids, when you ask them, what's your dream job? You hear a lot people saying, especially, I don't want to do a gender thing on this, but so many little girls say, I want to be an actress, I want to be a movie star. And that's because so much is wrapped up in our perception of actors that has nothing to do with the actual art of acting. In the States, we put our actors, our movie stars up on this pedestal. Is the dream of being a comédien in France similarly widespread to your mind?
The dream, like in general, of being a movie star?
Yeah, like do you think that as many little French kids, when they get asked, what do you want to be when you grow up, they say, I want to be a movie star, as American kids do?
I would say no.
Okay.
I think that this culture doesn't reward massive dreams in that way.
Fair enough. And actors in France who are working actors, I think maybe America in general has like a shoot for the stars kind of mentality in a lot of realms, not just in acting, although being a movie star is definitely somewhere where we see it quite viscerally. In France, when you work as an actor, I have friends who work as actors, and it's not, bussing tables while also auditioning for roles alongside some, Natalie Portman and Pierce Brosnan. I don't know why those are my movie stars of reference. I obviously haven't watched a movie since 1995. So I think that, the French actors that I've met, or people in France working as actors, have a very specific sort of structure to their lives and to their working status, which we've talked about on our episode about entrepreneur. Can you kind of break down what it means to be an actor from a status perspective in France? What does that look like?
So, yes, I think you're talking about the intermittent du spectacle.
I am.
So it's not actually a work status per se. It would be more like into Pôle emploi, like an unemployment status.
Okay.
Kind of thing. So the way that it works is that you have, within 1 year, if you are anyone in these arts, in film or television or theater, so whether you're talent or whether you're crew, you have a year to accumulate a certain number of hours. So as an actor, the number is 507. So you have to have worked for 507 hours within the past year, and you accumulate enough. They're called cachets. You work au cachet, and a cachet is like one cachet is 12 hours worth of work. So you accumulate these cachets until you've got 507 hours of work within 12 months. And once you hit that, then you can apply for this specific status of intermittent du spectacle. And that means that they're going to take the money that you made over the past year and figure out from that how much you're going to be allocated so that you can then go on unemployment, quote unquote, for the next 12 months. So because the way that this industry works, it's not like a 35-hour work week where you show up every day for 8 hours and then you get vacation and all of that and you're taken care of by your company. The way that this industry works is that you work for a specific period of time and then you wait and you find your next project. And in order to support actors, this was created in 1936, this idea for actors, so that you would be protected all the time and you wouldn't have to default to doing some other kind of busy work or letting your dream die and getting some corporate job because you need to make enough money to live. What they do is they pay you a little bit less from the cachets that you're working, but then you get money throughout the entire year. So you're basically salaried.
Okay. And so this is the counterpoint to what in the US would be you work, a service job or a retail job while hoping that something is going to pan out. And then you end up having to quit your service job so that you can do the project. And then you have to find another service job when that's over.
Essentially, yes. And in the US, the only thing that we have that's remotely like this would be SAG-AFTRA, which is a union. So it's the Screen Actors Guild and the American Film and Television Radio Association. And it's basically a union. So you can get health insurance through it, which we don't need here, obviously, in France, but you don't get unemployment through it. You can get retirement funds and you can get pension funds, and they'll help you with unemployment, but they won't provide it themselves. And the other difference is that here in France, you don't need to join a union. But in the US, if you want to do any of these well paying jobs, any upper echelon jobs, you have to be in the union. You don't have a choice. And you have to pay dues to be in the union.
Okay. And that's not the only way that sort of acting looks really different in the US as it does in France. And when it comes to sort of training, I feel like there are common narratives that we hear. For example, in the UK, you hear a lot of people having done drama school and having been in the theater for a long time before they ever make it onto the big or small screen. In the US, you hear a lot about people who had this dream, went to one specific city, so Los Angeles, and just auditioned until they finally got their, in big quotes, their big break. Is there like a narrative or kind of a structure that you feel a lot of French comédiens go through in the same way as something that's comparable to those two stories that we're kind of familiar with?
So I would say the idea is a little bit more similar to the British idea. So in the US, as you said, like we have sort of this idea of anybody can be an actor. It doesn't have to be serious. It's not like a really, deep intellectual profession. And you can go to school. You probably should go to school, but you don't have to. In fact, you can just be discovered on YouTube and become the next big sensation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that that's the perception here at all. So here, again, schooling is very important, as with everything in France. So, here you've talked about this before in your podcast, but you choose your life path at 16, and that's what you're going to do. So if you're going to be a serious actor here in France, you're going to do the same kind of thing. So you're going to choose to go to a national, regional, or departmental conservatory or a national school or a university. There are some that are very well regarded, like Cours Florent. And you're going to want to try to get those and get conservatory training before you become an actor. One of the other big differences that I can see is that in the US, we put a lot of emphasis on improvisation, especially when you're first starting out. Like if you're a kid and you go to an acting class, you're going to play lots of games. And even as an adult, when you're starting off, it's usually a lot of improv, trying to make each other laugh, very like UCB training. And then in the UK, you have my impression is much more of a serious route. You want to go to the Royal Academy. You study your classics first. And once you've mastered the classics, then you move on. I think it's a lot more like that here in France. They don't study improv. Most of the actors that I've come in contact with never tried improv until they were older. And then it was because they were taking like an American acting class or something like that. So they're not as familiar with that kind of play. It's also quite important for them to study the classics, study like Molière and Racine and these sorts of classics here in France. And it also really matters what school you went to. So in the US, when you're auditioning and they say, tell us, about yourself, you'll say, okay, here's my name and my height and my weight. And they'll be like, okay, great, act. Whereas here, here, they're like, okay, present yourself. And so you have to do like a formal introduction. My name is blah, blah, blah. I went to this university. I studied under this person. And then I studied here. And I have these skills, like a whole, like you would do in a normal interview kind of situation. So there's much more weight put on your education versus just your starry-eyed ambition.
Okay, wow. And yeah, that does seem, like you said, to reflect the way that the French position their perception of kind of schooling and training and how important it is to be well trained and trained at the right places to do a job, whether it's, acting or translating or, pretty much anything. If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This, which will clue you into some of the most interesting events happening in Paris right now. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. I remember when I first became a tour guide, I had to write a very, very verbose letter about why I deserved to be a tour guide, even though I'd been doing it for years because I hadn't been to tour guiding school.
Right. So that reminds me of a story anecdotally.
Yeah.
I have a client he's French. He was a child actor here in France, very successful. He got a job when he was a teenager in a production that took place in Scotland. And so he was in this Scottish production for a few years. It was very well received, well known. He was quite good in it. He got a lot of accolades for it. And when he came back here to France, having, his ego all blown up, he's lovely. I don't mean to imply that he isn't.
Mm-hmm.
But he got back here. He's like in his late teens, early 20s. He's charming. He's good looking. He's charismatic. He's a very good actor. He's bilingual. And when he goes for a casting in French, they look at his CV and they say, oh, and this whole section of time where he was doing this well-known production that just filmed in another country, they don't count that at all. It's like a black mark on his record because he wasn't here in France the whole time.
Oh, wow.
So he's having a difficult time like picking his career up as an actor here in France because of that. And now he's looking to the US instead.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting one in terms of the French actors that managed to percer in the United States. I'm thinking of people like Marion Cotillard because of her Edith Piaf, L'Avion Rose in English it was, or Omar Sy because of, his work in Intouchable and in Lupin, or even Jean Dujardin, which of course always makes me laugh because he came through as like a very serious actor when I always knew him as playing Brice Janice. So he was a total lunatic on television, and then he comes across the pond and manages to become a serious actor. Do you think that what's the perception of a French comédien who decides to try and go and make it abroad?
So I think this is a really interesting question. So there are two very different film industries, the US film industry and the French film industry. And one of the cultural quirks, let's say, of the French is that anyone who gets too big, too well-known, too famous is immediately hated. So like when you're running for president, you can be beloved, but the second you become president, everybody hates you.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's just the cycle of life. And I think that there's that perception here as well. You don't want to be too big or too famous because you won't be respected. I think that here there's more of an emphasis on the quality of the work that you do and the people that you surround yourself with. So if you were to ask a serious actor here in France, they would tell you, oh, I would rather work with a really well-known actor and a really fabulous director in a small, serious film than do the next Marvel blockbuster.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that's true, but I think that's what they would tell you.
Okay.
I think that there is naturally this desire to have fame and glory and all of that. And one of the major differences, the reason that that doesn't happen here in France, besides the cultural reason, is because the US film industry has so much money. And culturally, Americans are programmed to take big risks. So, Americans, first of all, they have the money, and then they'll throw millions of dollars at a stupid, big, I don't know, superhero movie. And if it flops, they're like, oh, that flopped. Let's do something else. Whereas here in France, they don't have the funds to do that. They don't have the room to play around in that kind of way. If they were to throw millions of euros at a film and it flopped, it would devastate them. You could see that really clearly in television. Like if you look at French television, most of it comes from other places because they're very risk adverse and they don't have money. So they would rather take a television show from somewhere else, like Friends or How I Met Your Mother, and dub it here, or remake a show that's worked very well somewhere else, like Koh Lanta, which is Survivor, than to do their own original programming because it's more dangerous here and they're risk adverse. So if you are an actor and you reach the top of the ceiling here and you want to become bigger and you want to become famous and you want to become rich and you want to become a movie star, the natural step for you is to go to the US. It's really kind of your only choice. And that's why I do my voice acting coaching, because it's for people who want to work in American film. Because at a certain point, there's only so far you can go in French film.
Okay, that's really that's really an interesting distinction, and I think that whole idea of the French kind of being skeptical or almost or averse to too much success feels like pervasive, not just in Comédie, but kind of you do see that in other realms, like you said, with the president, or even just people who get too excited about a new project that they're working on, and your friends are kind of like, huh, okay, why are you bigging yourself up so much? I want to go back a little bit to something that you brought up. We were talking about Comédie at the outset, which is that this isn't just linked to acting, or I mean, it is and it isn't. And I wanted to just sort of circle back to one of the instigators, the originators of the French comedy, who is Molière. We have a theater here in France called the Comédie Française, which people sometimes call Molière's home. Can you tell us a little bit about Molière's role in making a uniquely French comédie?
Yes, but I will say that it's more influenced by Molière than done by him himself, but
Okay.
I'll specify. So if we go back to the 1600s, back in time, in the mid to late 1600s, there were two French theater troupes. There was the Hotel de, oh, I can never say it right. Oh no, I can't do it. Guenegaud.
Oh,
Jennifer, something like that. And that was Moliere's company. So he was in that troupe. He was, the head of that troupe, and it was the troupe that performed comedies. And then there was the Hotel de Bourgogne, and that was Racine's theater troupe, and they performed tragedies. So there were two rival troupes, and they were vying to see who was better and who was worse, and stupid stuff like that. And at the same time, there was an Italian theater here, Comédie Italienne, and they were very big and trendy. So Louis XIV, who loved Molière was like his favorite, he wanted to combine the two French troupes to make one massive Comédie Française to stop the stupid rivalry, to promote French theater, and to say French theater is so much better than these stupid Italians. And as far as I can tell, the only difference between Comédie Française and Comédie Italienne is just the language that they speak. That's what I could tell.
okay.
But when this was formed in 1680, Molière had already been dead for 7 years.
Okay. Okay.
So it was formed with him in mind, and the theater then performed comedies and tragedies. They would bounce back from one to the other. They had all of Moliere's repertoire and all of Racine's and everyone else's. And Molière over time has become like the patron saint of the Comédie Française, even though he wasn't there when it started.
Okay. And I do hear him mentioned as like the founding father of the 5-act French comedy. Is that accurate?
Yes.
So he's got a lot of influence, but as often in France, it was a little we exaggerate just a tad.
Well, and it wasn't even called the Maison de Molière until much later, until the 1700s or something. So,
got it. So what's the state of French acting today in terms of as a career, but also, I mean, you mentioned, some of this way in which French actors are kind of looking to America for their influence. They're maybe journeying to America. You're starting to see slightly more high budget French television, notably with Lupin and things like that. Do you get the sense that there's a lot of American influence here in terms of the way that it works and the way that people work, or is it still remaining fairly French?
do you mean like on the ground on set?
Let's go with both. On the ground on set, and also in terms of what people are looking to produce, what kind of art people are looking to make.
Well, I'll answer the first part first. So on the ground, no, I would say it's the same. I would say that the way that French actors and the set runs every day is distinctly French, in that you show up on time, but then you have your cigarette and a couple cups of coffee, and then you work for a bit, and then you take a break, and then you work for a bit, and then you take a break. And, if you've got a certain amount of work you need to get done in 8 hours, you'll get it done in 8 hours, but sort of lackadaisically. Whereas in the US, like when you show up, you're ready to go. You work all day. And if you finish your 8 hour, like what was planned for those 8 hours early, you just do more.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the way that it works on the ground. So that hasn't changed as far as I can tell. In terms of what's happening in the industry as a whole, I still think that the industry is quite risk adverse, but with things like Netflix, which has an office, well, it had an office in France and then it moved to Belgium, I think, for tax purposes, but they're still producing French content. I think with that becoming more fluid and becoming more successful, that maybe the door is opening to have more of a wider variety of styles here in France. But I do think the US is always going to be the leader because of what I said before, because they have the money and because they're already so far ahead in that way. But to that same token, I think it's much more common to watch something in America with subtitles. So I think that French actors are getting more notoriety in the US, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. And you alluded to something also that I think we definitely have to talk about, which is that, your other job, your job as a voice coach, and this fact that France did, as you said, dub Friends and How I Met Your Mother, whereas in the US we are maybe more comfortable with subtitling. Why do you think that is? And do you get a sense that, there will ever be a market for dubbing into American English?
Dubbing into American English?
Yeah, in the way that in France, everything. I mean, I know that people more and more are watching VOST, version originale sous-titrée, but we do, if you turn on the French television, you get old episodes of Friends, old episodes of The Simpsons, old episodes of Grey's Anatomy, and they're all dubbed into French.
Yes.
And in America, you won't find that.
I don't think we'll have dubbing in America. I don't know, maybe it's just my own personal aversion to it. I don't think so. I think it would be much more likely. We're really familiar. We weren't even 10 years ago, but we're much more familiar now, in large part thanks to Netflix. We're much more familiar now with reading subtitles.
Mm-hmm.
And there are now a lot more television shows that are in multiple languages. Like an American English television show will have part of it that's in Chinese and subtitled or in Spanish and subtitled, and that doesn't cause any kind of problems anymore. So I don't think that dubbing will become the standard.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Paris: A State of Mind, where real estate experts Gail and Marie give you all the tips and tricks you need about renting and buying apartments in Paris and beyond. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Do you think dubbing will remain fairly standard in France, or do you expect to see people moving more towards what I'm starting to see as a layperson whose closest cultural reference is Pierce Brosnan, that we're starting to see people sort of foregoing dubbing in favor of subtitling.
I hope so. When I first moved here and was constantly graded by the dubbing, I would ask people, French people, why they preferred the dubbing to the subtitles. And it was the same answer if you asked an American, 15 years ago. It's just laziness. It's easier to hear it in your own language. But I think the more you're exposed to subtitling and the more you understand how important it is that the voice match what's happening. Like, a lot of my problem with dubbing is that it's a voice that doesn't go with the person. It doesn't fit the mood of the story. Sometimes it can even be the same voice dubbing everything, which blows my mind. And I think the more that people become familiar with subtitling, the more they become familiar with reading. And again, a lot of credit to Netflix, because I think people are often reading subtitle programs on Netflix. I think it'll become more standard. And also, I imagine for the studios, it's got to be cheaper just to throw some subtitles on there than to pay actors to dub things.
One would think, yeah. Well, Jennifer, it has been such a pleasure having you on the podcast. You know what I'm going to ask you now, because you've been editing these podcasts for a long time. What is your favorite word in French?
I'm so excited to finally answer this question. I've been answering it in the editing booth for a year now. My favorite French word is insupportable.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, I love it. It's just like, to me, it sums up everything that is charming and melodramatic about the French.
Yeah.
Because they'll take something that is just really mundane and be like, oh, this is insupportable. I can't live like this. How can I go on? And I love it.
Another super fun false friend that we're going to have to delve into in a future podcast, because supporter looks like to support,
right?
But it really means to put up with. And so insupportable is something that you absolutely cannot put up with. It is above your ability. This is something up with which I shall not put. So Winston Churchill, and so say the French all the time.
Yes, exactly. This is unstand-up-withable.
Exactly. All right. Well, it is unstand-up-withable that I must leave you now, but I have had so much fun talking with you about Comédie. And thanks everybody for tuning in to Navigating the French. We're looking forward to talking more about the French and what makes them tick in future episodes. Edited by the lovely Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Emily. This was wonderful.
Thank you. This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Geraghty for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.